I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with the small print. And today my guest is Edward Castronova. And as always on the show, we like to get our guests to introduce themselves the way they like to be introduced. So Ted, please do introduce yourself.
Thanks. It's great to be on, Bronwyn. Let's see how to introduce oneself. I'm a failed economist. I have a PhD in economics, and I started out, I was a little junior professor in economics, and I just got so down about, my career and how tough it was that I started playing video games a lot. And then it hit me to start studying the economies in the video games, because I thought that'd be a lot more fun than studying things like the capital gains tax rate and things like that. So I just started studying video game economies, and that turned out to be very successful. So, but there was this prior period of frustration that led to the change, and I'm sure most people who are interested in the digital economies and things like that have had that same sort of experience where they just left the boring world and started looking at this interesting world. So since then, I've been a professor. I'm a professor at Indiana University right now, and I spend a lot of my time, other than teaching and research, I do consulting for companies about setting up their virtual economies and dealing with all the problems that come up.
Yeah, so I do want to take the viewers, listeners back a bit in time, because you were very early into the space. You were definitely one of the first, certainly one of the first actual academic economists that started looking at the reality of the virtual economy, which is, of course, just one further degree abstracted from the financialized economy, which you've all kind of got used to since the advent of plastic credit cards. But do you want to take us back to that point in time and the sorts of resistance perhaps you got from the academic faculty, or the eyebrows that were raised when you started raising these points as being worthy of study and taking seriously?
Well, I started my intro by saying I'm an economist. Now, economics is correctly and rightfully a pretty conservative profession in terms of just not politically conservative, but just being very careful about statements and what is an advance and what isn't. And so my very first work on this was a paper that I thought only graduate students would read, and it ended up getting, I think it has more than 50,000 downloads now, and but economists just weren't interested in it. And I knew why, and I agree with them. So there's nothing in virtual economies that breaks new ground as far as economic knowledge or theory is concerned. My work was pretty much taking very, very simple economic ideas and showing how they worked in a virtual environment. So from the standpoint of academic economics, there just wasn't anything that interesting there. So when I would send the paper off, they would say, well, right now we're just more interested in real economies than virtual economies, sort of saying, yeah, this is a discovery, but it's not that important. So in fact, that paper has never been published. It's just sat there on the internet getting downloads. And so there was among, sort of what you might call traditional social scientists, this view that it certainly wasn't important that much, right then. But other people who were more forward-looking in other fields, there are futurists, for example, and of course, people who knew about the digital world as it was in the year 2000. They said, yes, this is going to become a thing. And I can report to your viewers that as of 2 or 3 years ago, very high-level economists at MIT are saying we need to create a new version of GDP. And GDP is the statistic for measuring how much value the economy produces. Their idea is that GDP-B should include the value of virtual items. So I feel vindicated in that sense, even though I was the only one saying it 20 years ago. Today, it's proven to be, yeah, it's the thing.
Well, of course, the question is, where do you draw the line between what's real and what's virtual? I have my own ideas, but where do you draw that line, or at all? Or do you say there shouldn't be a line?
Yeah, I think as far as economic value goes, there is no difference, right? Because just never mind the digital world. Let's go back to the year 1700, okay? In that time, people put a lot of value on diamonds, as we do now, even though back then there was actually no use for them. So the fact that something has value doesn't really have anything to do fundamentally with its whether it's virtual or real, or it's just whether or not people want to pay for it. Right? It's called the subjective theory of value. It was developed in the 1800s by economists, and it says, you know, we have to get away from, like, you know, looking at this pencil and saying, well, this really isn't valuable, so it shouldn't cost anything. You know what? Water is very valuable and doesn't cost a whole lot for, you know, folks, at least where I live. Whereas, you know, diamonds aren't worth any, you know, they don't serve any purpose, but they're very expensive. So in the sense of, you know, economic value, like I said, there just is no difference between a URL, a digital sword, the color red on a car, a new dress, you know, a hammer. Those things all get their value from the same thing, which is people's subjective valuations. Just briefly, I'll say there's a huge difference as far as law and culture, but not in terms of economics, between virtual and real.
Okay, so let's go down that road, because we do cover all those topics on this show: politics, philosophy, economics, all the rest of it. Where would you draw the line then as distinct from then law and politics, as you were saying?
So I think that we are more healthy as a society, and individuals are more healthy if they recognize firmly the difference between a fantasy environment and a non-fantasy environment. And so I'm going to call the non-fantasy environment real, even though everything's real, right? Or everything's unreal, depending on your point of view. I'm just going to stick with real and virtual. And I think in my studies over the years have convinced me that it's when fantasy things go into the real world, that creates problems. When real world things go into fantasy environments, that creates problems. And those problems are not economic in nature. In fact, markets and economies are always trying to break down that barrier. But I think it's, for example, it's better for a game that it be separated from all kinds of real world influences, right? Who wants to go play a Monopoly game with a rich kid who starts with $1,000 every time, right? That's not fun.
It's got to be fun. What's the point in playing?
Yeah, you have to make it fair. So this goes back to a Dutch historian named Johan Huizinga, who was the first one to point out what he called the magic circle. So play happens within this magic circle, and you know, things outside the magic circle get ruined when play things go outside, and then play gets ruined when things from outside come in. I'm going to share one story about that. It's from the American game baseball, and all you need to know about baseball for this story is that the ball, which is about this big, goes up in the air, and if it gets caught, then the person batting is out. Okay, so it's a very important game. The Chicago Cubs, very important. And here comes the ball, and one of the players is running to catch it, and this guy named Steve Bartman was sitting in the stands, and he reached out and he interfered with the ball so the player couldn't catch it. And because of that, the baseball team lost that game. And to me, that's a perfect example of how something real, Steve Bartman, just an ordinary fan and a pretty nice guy, of course, he just reached for the ball. But that got into the play world and caused all kinds of problems.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analogy. And I think there's a lot of lines in society where that can be said to be where the problems are coming from, even when you look at the difference between like globalized and national economies, right? I mean, like so much of economic theory is still based on the sort of perfect Robinson Crusoe economy, which works until things from the outside world come into it. And I think that people are only starting to grapple with that in the virtual space. I think a lot of people who've tried to build real value in the virtual arena, in Web3 or the metaverse or crypto, or whatever you want to be calling this new space that we're going into, seem to have kind of forgotten about those rules, and they seem to think that you can have the privileges of a Robinson Crusoe private economy and then also the perks of, like, you know, global capital flows. But it's a trade-off. You kind of have to choose. Then you kind of what you gain in access, you do lose in sovereignty, and that means that there's a whole lot more chaos starts creeping into these systems. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Bronwyn. You expressed it very well. I think that many of the things that are wonderful about virtual economies are only possible because they're disconnected from real economies. You know, just as I was saying about monopoly, just the basic idea of economic fairness. We don't have that. We all, in the real world, right? We all start
We have
with
different endowments, and we can't fix that
different endowments.
problem without making more problems.
Right. And so it's like Tolkien wrote very movingly about the idea that if you ask too many questions about a fantasy environment, you ruin it. And there's a lot of like elf related stories where the elves do all this wonderful stuff, and then this curious person goes and interferes, and poof, it goes away. And that's why in 2003, I wrote a paper called The Right to Play, where I advocated for a body of law that would identify when a society, let's say, or community or something, is a play community, and that the rules would be different in there. And my thought was that the law could create a new country. That just the way the law creates new people, when it creates a corporation, it's treated technically as a person in the law, but it serves certain purposes and it has strict regulations. And I would say we should do the same thing for land. We should basically say, this World of Warcraft is a separate country, and that's established in law. And we have all these laws about the benefits that they get and also the restrictions. So they can't like allow the selling of virtual gold and things like that. So that was 2003. And who knows, maybe that could happen someday too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people are grappling with this space also in the whole sort of DeFi crypto world once again. And again, they're running into the same questions. I think a lot of people have gone into this for the very noble, but perhaps quite naive ideas. And other people have gone into a very cynical, cash grabby intentions. I mean, like that's just the way the world is. We have some people that are more altruistic and other people that are more capitalistic.
Right.
But unfortunately, or fortunately, we run into each other all the time. And that any sort of world that we build does have to be at least basically human proof. In other words, there have to be some sorts of compatible incentives. Otherwise, you are going to end up with massive wealth extraction, which is I think what we're seeing at the moment. Everything's sort of exploded so quickly into this space that you've been looking at for decades, but other people have only started thinking about since their mom bought an NFT and lost a lot of the family money on it, quite frankly. And that's sort of the place we are right now, where ordinary people, normal people, not academics, not economists, not futurists, are thinking about what value really is. And if there are opportunities to get value in the metaverse. But I think it's also important from at least from my perspective, and I'd be very grateful if you challenged me on it. And then I do tend to think that almost everything that takes place in the virtual economy is very similar to everything that takes place in the financialized economy, which is distinct again from the real economy. And I determine the real economy as being the economy where there is actual scarcity. Like there is an actual finite amount of water that we can get to. And there's a finite amount of human attention. I would put that in there too. And there's a finite amount of labor and talent. And that's kind of the distinction between the real and the financialized, and again, even more abstracted virtual economies. And I think that it's an interesting idea to play with when you start to think about how the virtualized and financialized economies are really about redistributing claims to real scarcity, rather than they are about creating new sources of value in a very real sense. So, there's a lot of paper money going on in these casinos, right? Which is what they really are. I mean, the financial economy is the same thing. Every other credit-based economy is also a giant casino. You got to cash out.
That's how I would express that. To me, that sounds like the really important connection between financial transactions and virtual transactions is the fact that there's the marginal cost of producing things is zero.
Yeah,
I can endlessly produce new swords, just as I can endlessly issue shares to my company. And you're right; these are all claims. Ultimately, well, actually, this is a question. Ultimately, does our happiness depend on the things that you've defined as real, things that have a positive marginal cost of production? And or can we just be completely satisfied with digital experiences and claims to them? I mean, I think I'm accepting, I guess what I'm saying is the objective analysis that you're making. That's good. And I'm just sort of taking the conversation a little bit farther by saying, is it the case that so long as the real things are distributed properly, everyone is happy? Or is it actually do we even need to do that? Can we have a bunch of real inequality and yet virtual equality so that everyone's happy? I think that is a big question.
It is a big question. It's a question that's coming across from like the philosophy side. Sorry, I can't speak this afternoon. What a terrible job. Like the philosophers are debating this. So are corporates, so are governments. I mean, you got the whole Mark Andreessen and his reality privilege thing, you know, like let them eat NFT cake, which is kind of the trite way of saying what he's saying, right? If people can be happy in the metaverse, who cares if they're sleeping in a sleeping bag on the side of the highway, right? And other people like David Pierce, again, we've had on the show, talks about like hedonic treadmill, like if people's pleasure senses can just be triggered, and we can trigger people's pleasure senses in the virtual world. We don't have to do it physically. You know, we can do this through setting up little dopamine quests through gaming environments or through triggers that come and like, you know, give us that oxytocin hit that we need from socializing with people. We can make people happy, but to the point that like those rats and mice on those literal hedonic treadmills, that we only chase that pleasure and that happiness to the detriment of our physical bodies. There's kind of like a distinction there. And like, can we distribute happiness better through virtual goods, services, virtual experiences, virtual triggers? I think that's a slightly different question to the more basic one, which is, can we, like the things that actually are required to keep us alive? And that's something we've always grappled with as humans, you know, like there's things that we have to, the real scarce things, the things that like water and food and shelter, that will actually, this is the difference between survival and extinction. And then there's a whole lot of other stuff which we want only because other people want it, which goes into that whole sort of Brene Girard and mimesis conversation that everyone's talking about. Once again, it's very trendy, which is why I'm quite reluctant to bring it up, but that's really what it is. And there's a very distinct, but also still sometimes fuzzy line between the things that we need, the really real scarce things, and the things that we want, which is actually the realm of artificial scarcity. And I think it's quite interesting that conversations around artificial scarcity only really started to be taken seriously around the sort of time the Bitcoin paper was published, right? Before then, we were talking, like you said, about digital abundance and about how the internet was driving the cost down to zero and we can all have access to happiness for nothing. And that was what the internet was about until Bitcoin came along and started putting artificial scarcity into those digital goods and services once again, in order to give them some sort of artificial value. Because that whole idea of artificial value without artificial scarcity, people believe in it only for so long, and then suddenly the price of the ape coins drops as a sort of the belief filters out of the system, and suddenly all that value disappears and the carpet rolls up again.
That was one of my earliest questions about this, the idea of the artificial scarcity being in digital worlds, recognizing that people actually liked it. In other words, you could make a game where you could just have everything, but of course that's not interesting. So it really raises profound questions about, you know, what, you know, do we need scarcity in order to be happy? And I'd also like to say, I think a lot of the contradictions and the difficulties in this discussion sort of point up to me that we don't understand what it takes to actually be happy. We don't really understand what happiness is. And I would say, just speaking as a Catholic, that the what you might call religious view is attractive in one sense, is that it says what you say you want to do is not necessarily what is the right thing for your life. So it allows you to have like an objective outside assessment and look and say, is this a good life? So someone sleeping in a sleeping bag with VR, and they're insanely happy, but from a sense of a flourishing life or a good life, which
they're literally dying.
Can't really
if they
access
keep in that
way
state, they will perish.
Utilitarian. But if you're being let's say Thomistic, or, you know, say Thomas Aquinas or something, then you have no trouble. You walk up and you say, that is not how a person should live. And so it is bad. And we know that you'll flourish if you stop sleeping in that sleeping bag on the sidewalk. So it's kind of, you know, I personally don't have trouble with this problem. I think only if you're like a utilitarian who's committed to the idea of personal, that everybody defines what their happiness is, then it's a problem.
Oh, I do tend to agree. I mean, I must make a note that Ludwig, who you met earlier, our producer on the show, is quite a staunch utilitarian. So we have a lot of debates on that. But I tend to agree with you. I think that utilitarianism is the root of all sorts of sort of banal evil, right? Like it
Mm.
starts out as being very, very innocent, but very quickly you're torturing the proverbial baby underneath the city in order to keep
Right,
everyone else happy. All roads kind of lead to very dark conclusions when you try to
right.
quantify this vacuous thing known as human happiness, which is
Yeah,
again coming back to the whole sort of basis of the problem with economics. That's always been the question, right? This idea of utility. What is utility? What is it that we're
yeah,
chasing? And we try to have a proxy of it with money, but money is a poor proxy of
yeah.
power, let alone being a poor proxy of actual happiness. It can only
Yeah.
take us so far.
So the psychology, I just did a theory paper about happiness, and so I looked into the psychological literature on it, and basically, there's two kinds of happiness. One is like immediate pleasure, and that's what games give you. That's what eating food gives you. That's what sex gives you, that immediate pleasure. But happiness is kind of bigger than that. It's this sense of contentment, joy, being at peace. And for that, you need things that are really essentially what the ancient wisdom traditions tell us. So you need to feel like you have a vocation, that there's something that you contribute. You need to be in relationships that are long lasting and deep. You need to have a sense of meaning, like about what is the world all about? What is my purpose in the universe? Not my purpose, because that's a vocation, but like, what is the universe like? You need to have a coherent explanation for that. So for a lot of people, that's a God thing, but it could be like a nature thing or something like that. And so it's these ancient wisdom traditions. And this social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, he wrote an entire book about, what we need to do maybe is kind of reconnect to those ancient wisdom traditions, because it turns out people who are happy in old age, that's why, they've done all those things right. I volunteer for hospice, so I watch, it's a terrible privilege, but I sit with people who are dying, and they really don't talk about the things that, like the kind of pleasures that a video game gives. They don't talk about that. They talk about relations and their vocation and of course God. So yeah, I guess we're kind of far afield, and we were supposed to be talking about economics, but this is, I have to say, one of the reasons I did not write a lot of economics papers, which I could have done. I could have just, and these other questions came to my mind, and they were very interesting. So that's what I've been pursuing.
I definitely tend to agree. I also study economics up until a fairly high level, but again, I can't claim to be an economist. I've never been paid to do that job, not at all. Quite the opposite. But you do run into these questions really, really quickly if you do have an inquiring mind. I mean, it's really right there on chapter 1 of the textbook. Like, what is this utility thing, right? And when you start going down that rabbit hole, quite quickly, if you run into the very big questions for yourself. Like, as far as I've kind of got it down to two sort of phrases that we can work with. Like, you got to know yourself and you got to connect with people. Like, that's kind of it. That's the life journey. Yes. And that brings us back to virtual environments and gaming worlds and all the rest of it. They're all about connection and also about self-discovery. I mean, like, what else is there really? Like, other than sort of eating, sleeping, and as you say.
There's a tremendous social justice that's been achieved in that many isolated people now talk to other people, and you can't quantify that. And I think we also need to assess, like, obviously some of these relationships aren't going well, in the sense that folks who are socialized this way are perhaps more ignorant, misinformed, angry, right? So we may not be doing it right, but many people who are isolated are not isolated right now.
Yeah, that is a wonderful thing. That is an actual value of the virtual world, right? Which comes back down to my sort of thesis that basically in the metaverse or in the Web3 space, like your core scarce resource there is human attention, right? So if you're attracting people's attention, if you're holding people's attention, which you do by putting other people in the room, because that's what we are, right? We're attracted to each other. That's how you attract attention.
It's a voluntary thing. I mean, one of the great teachings of econ is that capitalism is a social justice movement, in the sense that one person is creating something from nothing that somebody else wants, and in the process, a lot of times hiring somebody else, and so doing something like putting up a game in which people meet one another. Yeah, you make money, but look, you're doing a
You're
lot of
creating
good.
value out of nothing. Yes.
So, I think a lot of these developments are very, very good. And whenever I've given talks, and over the years, I've given a lot of talks to serious people, and they really, not so much now, but in the early days, they would really push back. They'd be like, this bunch of game stuff, who cares? It's all really stupid. And gamers are bad people. Okay. And that's where I would draw the line. I said, okay, look, if you're 43 years old and you're married and you have several kids, you should not be spending 8 hours a week on a video game, granted. But what if you're a girl in a small town and your body type is not just so, and you're an angel inside, but everybody is picking on you and everybody hates you, and you go online and suddenly you can be the angel that you actually are. And I said, there's still a problem with that. There is still a problem, but the problem is not with her, it's with us. We have created a society so that create situations where people look into video games for things like emotional support. The people would say, oh, it's ridiculous. Gamers treat like these wizards in video games like father figures. And I go, well, can you blame them? A lot of people don't have father figures in this real world. So I think I've always thought video games kind of hold up a mirror to our society and say, these are the aspirations that this society is not meeting. And among them is like the feeling of being on a quest, the feeling of agency, the feeling of being important, and relationships.
The feeling of having actual agency of your life, which is, I think, also quite a big one. I end up speaking about this quite a lot, like corporate events and these sorts of shows. This whole thing about people have no sense of agency in their real lives, and that's not because they don't have agency, but because they have that sense of agency has been stripped away. Whereas they still have that sense of it in a game. If your life isn't going well in your quest, you can reboot, right? You can change your skin, you can change your hair, you can do all these things. So there's this greater sense of agency, and that could actually be a good thing if you can take it back to the real world and start applying it. So I think that's
interesting you say that. I give a talk about Tolkien, and Tolkien was very strong about the idea that fantasy is important. And I tell audiences, look, you could think of going into a video game as an escape, but I think Tolkien is asking us to see it as a refuge, which is exactly what you just said, right? The idea is, okay, you have a feeling that you don't have agency. You go into a video game, you strategize, you plan, you show yourself that you can do something. And then ideally what would happen is you would go out in the real world a better person, right? If video games are serving an excellent social function, that's what they would be doing. It's a refuge for people who are kind of exiting our broken society and restoring themselves before going back out.
Yeah, and you get to do do-overs too, right? So you can do it more than once. Like
Mhm.
whereas in your real life, perhaps you don't get all those tries to perfect those social skills, all those self-progression journeys that are so critical for us working through.
I think people
It can
get so
also be seen as a
hopeless.
form of therapy,
Yeah,
which I think
exactly.
is very interesting.
They sort of look at their lives. I'm dealing with young people all the time, and they're just wandering. They're like, there's no point in doing anything. And it's like, well, there is a point in doing something, but somehow or another, our society is just not letting these people feel like there's anything worth doing.
Well, my theory there is that it's because society has kind of trained us, particularly in the Weird West, that your purpose in life is to do something, to get somewhere, to get towards a goal. So it's more like where you're going that matters, as opposed to how you are doing it that matters. We don't put any focus onto the pleasure you get from doing a job well. We only put focus onto the pleasure of finishing the job, which means we end up doing a lot of bad jobs and we waste our lives, completing KPIs put together by some middle management bureau of inhuman resources, like their design of your life. And you achieve these little goals constantly, get the tiny little dopamine hits, but you don't actually ever do anything that makes you feel good about yourself. And you only get that by doing a job well, whatever that is. One of my favorite books, and if you do work with children or you have children of your own, I think most children could benefit from reading it, is a book called Momo by Michael Ende, who's best known for The Never Ending Story. He wrote that too. So, but Momo has this amazing character of Bibo the street sweeper, and all he does is sweep streets, but he does it as in a very, he takes pride in his work, and he's very content. And there's other characters that, of course, that are caught up with the, like life and work and saving time and making money rather than just doing a good job. And it's a fascinating story. It's
funny you mentioned that. That's a very, very old idea. I mean, one of my themes is that like I said, ancient wisdom has kind of been lost. This is called the Rule of Saint Benedict.
Okay? Very nice.
It's a set of rules for running a monastery. And one of the central ideas in here is that you should just work, not because you're trying to achieve something, but because work is good.
Work itself is good, not the results.
And then and the idea is, no matter what the work is, if you do it well, it's, in a way, it's holy. And if you take it out of the religious context and put it, today, it's like, yes, absolutely, choose a line of work where you're not that worried about how much money you make or any achievements or anything. It's more like, I like the thing I'm doing. I like just doing this thing that I'm doing. So, but
it's more than that. If you do whatever you're doing well, you will start to like it more. And I've had some truly terrible jobs. I mean, some very bad career choices early on in my life. But if you start to do the job well and take pride in it, you get more enjoyment out of it. Absolutely. Of course, if you do something you actually like, well, so much the better.
Right. I didn't like being an economist until I started studying video games, because I've always been a gamer. And then I was like, oh, this is actually a fun set of skills. This is enjoyable. So it's kind of like, you really do have to love what you like. I had a student once, and she hated business school. And I said, well, what do you actually like to do? What would you do if you weren't studying? And she said, oh, I go work out. I was like, no, because she felt like she had to always work out. And I was like, what would you do if you just had nothing to do? And she was embarrassed, but she said, I'd go shopping. That's what she liked to do. And I said, well, for what? She's really embarrassed now. She's like, shoes. I said, well, why don't you get a business degree and go work in a shoe company? You'll do better than the guy from Wharton who doesn't care about shoes. You love shoes, and you'll be around great shoes your whole life. So I don't know if she did that, but
I hope she did. I mean, that is the other thing when it comes to having value in this world of ours. It is making sure you have a unique skill set that you're not replaceable, and particularly as we get to automation and virtualization and all the rest of it, because as soon as you are kind of fitting into, as you say, like a Wharton type, you're a replaceable peg, right? No matter, even if you're a very expensive peg, you're still very replaceable. Whereas if you're a bit more eccentric, like yourself, right? I mean, there's no one else like you. Like, right. Not exactly. You can't find another one of you to just sort of plug into whatever you're trying to do now. And I think that sort of comes full circle, because the world is definitely ready for whatever you wrote back in the 90s. And suddenly I can't imagine that you're not in high demand at the moment.
I'm sorry, I lost the train there.
Oh, I can't imagine that you're not in high demand for consulting and for your expertise at this particular point in time.
It's funny. There was a lull during the pandemic, which is weird because it's all virtual stuff, you'd think. And then as the pandemic ended, then my inbox has been filled. I mean, it's not just, for a long time there early, it was, can you just talk to us for an hour, or can we just pick up the phone and talk to you and you could bill that. And now it's like we're looking at year-long contracts that people, it's very close to like saying, why don't you stop being a professor and come and work on our virtual economy? And the thing is, the consulting I'm doing used to be kind of impractical, in the sense of like, I had all these high economic ideas, and you can tell from this conversation that I love to talk about philosophy and culture. And they were like, they wanted things like, how do I set the tax rate on this sword on Tuesday? If you want to be rich, you got to talk to stock traders, not economists. Right? It's just like if you want to do electricity in your house, you talk to an electrician, not a physicist. But lately, a number of companies are now like really looking long term, and so they want someone who has what I might call intellectual experience, like who's wrestled with the ideas for a long time. And I don't think people really know this about me. I'm actually kind of a political scientist as well, because the area of economics I studied was governmental economics. And I
That
spent
comes through
10
in your books.
years in the political science department. That was my first job after my PhD. And so public policy and I guess something I've been saying for 20 years is people who run these communities need to realize that they are governments. And
Yes,
so they face all of the issues that the political philosophers have faced forever. Things like interest elicitation. How do you find out what the people really want? How do you communicate to them? What is the right process for developing new policies? These are horrible things to deal with in the real world. These are the most intractable problems in human history, right? That's why they say,
and they're
democracy
colliding
is
now into
horrible,
this
except it's better than everything else.
Web3 world, where you've got like centralization and platforms and metaverses on the one hand, and DeFi crazy DAOs and governance systems on the other, which are just completely incompatible.
These are all just the ancient human questions of how do you govern? And it's ugly, it's sausage, it's nasty. And I think a lot of people who are idealistic are like, well, now that we've got a virtual environment, we should be able to write a constitution that consists of 3 sentences and everything will be great. And no, it's really dirty and messy. And also there's a heavy responsibility, right? If we're going to say virtual people, metaverse designers, make the entire human race happy, go. That's a heavy lift.
Heavy lift. I mean, it's much easier to just give them drugs, right? Which is why, like, that's like
just directly stimulate the thing, right? Just hook me up, boss.
But that's a very good point in terms of the governance, because we try to oversimplify these things, and a lot of the pioneers in the virtual space dealing with a blank sheet think they can write, as you said, that sort of 3-line constitution and have it done. But they kind of forget that the entirety of the law is based on exceptions. Like that's what the legal system is based on, because there are so few black and white issues. Thou shalt not kill unless someone is trying to kill you, or unless it's an accident. What constitutes an accident? You can't make a rule, even a very good rule like that. You can't make it simple and have it computer says no, computer says go, because it will be inherently unjust by being perfectly just, which is why I think a lot of the whole sort of blockchain, immutable code, panopticon, social credit kind of systems are just fundamentally incompatible with human beings, because we are messy. Morality is really subjective. It's not objective at all.
Just messy. And there's an issue here of the people who are involved in this sector. They're great people and everything, but they are a rather select group. In other words, they don't spend a whole lot of time with ordinary people. And I think that hurts, right? It's kind of like I don't know, there are all these examples of folks who are out of touch with whoever they're trying to deal with. So think about in the area of commerce, there's a chef and he prepares this wonderful meal and it's delicious and it checks all the boxes in terms of art and sensation.
It's perfect.
Yeah, and then, and everybody goes to the McDonald's restaurant across the street, right? And it's kind of like it's the real messiness of human people is breathtaking. You have to kind of get dirty with people before you really understand it. So
which brings us back to economics again, like that Homo economicus only makes sense at scale on average. It doesn't make sense when you look at the individual man. And I think we tend to forget about those two things. Like aggregates make a lot of sense. You can't study groups unless you can look at the aggregate, but you can't apply that to the individual. So theory is the aggregate, practical, not so much.
All the information we get out of an economy comes from the prices, right? Price is the information, and you only get reasonable prices when you have lots of people trading. So I mean, the economy is an aggregate thing. It has its own force and power. I think technology is actually more powerful than economics, but there's similar sort of processes where nobody's controlling it, nobody has anything to do with it, and it just keeps cooking along. And so in that sense, all the governments, whether they're real or virtual, they're also reactive, right? They can't make the world into something they want. They can't declare that something has this price, right? They have to deal with the way people react to it. And it just makes it really hard.
really hard. None of these questions are easy, right? But that's why we have these conversations, and we leave them open-ended. But thank you so much for spending some time with me. I think it's still in the morning where you are, it's the evening with us in the Southern Hemisphere. But thank you so much. And if people want to find out more about your work, where can they look you up? Like, you got a website, right? Or where would you like to be contacted?
EdwardCastronova.com is my website. And I'm actually pretty busy right now, so but I'm open to talk about consulting things. But what I really like to do is teach and write. That's my most favorite thing. So, but I'm happy to be in conversations with people. Just let me know.
That's amazing, and definitely read the blog. You've got some really interesting stuff up there as you've been writing again recently.
Thank you
very much. So thank you so much for joining us. So this is the small print, and yeah, for more conversations like this, follow along. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.